Hello guys, welcome back to Audible Odyssey. So let's step into a world of immersive storytelling where gripping tales of mystery, horror and adventure come to life. Each narration is crafted to pull you into the heart of the story, creating an unforgettable audio experience. From spine-tingling horrors to timeless classics, Audible Odyssey Adventures is your gateway to thrilling journeys beyond imagination. Subscribe now, and let the stories take you to places you've never dreamed of. Audible Odyssey Presents. Mark Sutton sat in his usual corner of the dimly lit pub, sipping on a pint of beer that had long since gone warm, in the same place that he sat every time it was a typical Friday night at the Risen Crown, the kind of place where a smell of stale ale mixed with the faint aroma of greasy pub food. He knew the location well. He lived minutes away, just around the corner in his council flat. The regulars were already deep into their drinks, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny in the slightest, and complaining about the usual who of London life. Mark sat back in his seat, taking in the atmosphere, and smirked. It was 9 p.m. and the pub was filling up nicely. He was waiting, as he always did, for the patrons to reach that perfect level of inebriation, just enough to be open to suggestion, but not so drunk that they couldn't follow along. He'd been coming to this pub for years. He'd refined his little scan into a fine art now. It was effortless. The locals loved it. He loved it too, in his own way. It was easy money and easy fun, and it got even easier as the drinks piled up during the evening. A few vague predictions, some inane talk about the veil between worlds, and he'd have them eating out the palm of his hand. Of course, Mark didn't believe in any of it. Ghosts, spirits, the afterlife, it was all utter nonsense to him. But he'd always been a good talker with limitless charisma, and that was all that mattered in general. People wanted to believe, and he just gave them what they wanted. In his mind, he was offering a service to people that needed him. As the night wore on, he noticed a group of newcomers at the bar. They must have been work colleagues on a night out. Some of them still had their badges around their necks. They looked like they were out for a good time, laughing and clinking glasses. They must have been more than a few drinks in by this point. Perfect. He thought. Fresh blood was like a predator surveying his prey. He watched with laser focus as they reveled at the bar. As one of the group got up to go to the bathroom, he saw them stumble with that classic uneasiness on their feet that you get when you're a certain number of drinks down. It was time to get out of his seat. He took a deep breath and put on his most disarming and mysterious smile. His dark hair was slicked back, with his shirt just wrinkled enough to give him an air of disheveled charm. He approached the group with casual confidence. He wanted them to underestimate him and, most importantly, entertain his suggestions. Evening, folks, he said, his voice low and smooth like butter. Mind if I join you? They looked up slightly, stared at Elle, but he could tell they were intrigued. Sometimes he approached groups who told him to get lost immediately, but he jumped over the first hurdle. What he presumed to be the most senior of the group, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, nodded. Sure, mate. What's your story? Mark chuckled and pulled an empty seat from a nearby table. My name's Mark. I'm the local psych of sorts. I've been coming here for years, offering spirit readings to those who are curious. The bearded man raised an eyebrow, signaling his skepticism of a psychic. That's different, yes, but enlightening, Mark replied, leaning in as if sharing a secret. I can contact the spirit world and communicate with the dead. I'm quite good at it, actually. As the words left his mouth, the group exchanged glances. He scanned their faces with quick darts of his eyes. Some had a profound look of disbelief, whereas he could tell that others were curious. The idea was ridiculous to them, but, as luck would have it, they were just drunk enough to find it amusing. All right, fine, said the bearded man, smirking. Why not give us a reading? Then Mark put on his most cheesy mystical voice. It helped to keep the illusion and disarm them. More importantly, he had to get the money first. But first you must cross my palm with silver. The group looked confused before Mark briefly broke the facade, holding out his hand for 30 quid. It was a large group who were clearly not short of money, so they decided to entertain him, and the bearded man did a quick whip round. Some of the group pulled 5 and 1 notes out of their pockets and he handed him a small wad of cash. Mark bowed his head as he pocketed the money that would pay for his night's drinks. "You have my thanks, and with the most important part done," Mark started the performance. He loved the skeptics the most. They were the easiest to fool. He pulled a small worn deck of tarot cards from his pocket and spread them out on the table. The table was sticky from a night of spilled beer, but he persevered. Let's see what the spirits had to say this evening. He began his usual routine that he must have done it hundreds of times. At this point, he didn't even have to think about it. It was pure muscle memory. He shuffled the cards expertly and asked for someone in the group to draw one. As he turned the card over, he wrote a tale of vague predictions and half-truths. He continued to do this a few more times, eventually getting each person in the group to pick a card with him interpreting the outcomes. The group Low laughed throughout, occasionally glancing around as if expecting something to happen, but nothing did. Of course, it was all just performance and theatrics, a bit of fun for a Friday night. Mark finished the reading with an exaggerated flourish, leaning back in his chair, and there you have it, went the spirits have spoken. The bearded man clapped his hands with the others joining in. After a moment, "Not bad, mate, not bad at all." Mark's performance had gathered the attention of others at the pub, with the surrounding group getting larger and larger as the reading went on. The landlord and bar staff were even craning their necks to see what was going on. This was a unique opportunity. Mark realized he could see that most of the pub wanted more. There was something special in the air. He could make a killing if he went around the patrons for collections. Afterwards, they wanted to be impressed, to be scared, they wanted a real experience. The showman in him took over, raising his voice to acknowledge the enraptured group surrounding him. He asked, "Ladies and gentlemen, would like to go a bit deeper?" He glanced around for a split second and saw nods from the crowd. Once he knew he had their attention. He dropped his voice to a whisper. "There are other ways to contact the spirits, ways that are more intense." The crowd began to exchange excited glances. "Yeah, go on," then one of the women behind him said. Mark grinned. He had them hooked all right. Let's dim the lights a bit. We wanted to set the right mood. The landlord reached over and twisted the dimmer switch on the wall, plunging the pub into a softer, more intimate glow. One of the bar staff even managed to find some small candles in metal cups. They placed 2 of them on a table, and lit them. This was perfect. Mark thought now he just had to reel them in and he'd be drinking for free for weeks. Mark took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he spread his hands over the table. This was uncharted territory for him. He'd never had this level of interest before, but the pull was too strong. He had to take advantage of it. Besides, he was a master of improvisation. So he wasn't worried at all. He began to recite a few lines of gibberish. He was sure he'd heard it on some obscure TV show years ago, but he felt it sounded appropriately mystical. The large group watched in rapt attention, their earlier skepticism long forgotten as Mark continued his chant. Something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that seemed to creep in from nowhere. Mark felt it caused goosebumps on his skin, but brushed it off as the draft from a nearby window. He continued, raising his voice slightly, "Spirit of the other world, we call upon you, if there are any among us, make your presence known." There was a long pause. The showman. He was in full play tonight. He had to leave a long enough pause to build suspense, but not too long as to lose the crowd interest as the group watched him waiting. Mark could barely contain his smile, ready to say some clever line about how the spirits were shy tonight, but before he could speak, the lights in the pub flickered. The sudden change made the group jump, a nervous laugh escaping from one of the women surrounding him. "Nice touch," she said, her voice shaky, but to his great concern, Mark hadn't done anything he hadn't planned. That he glanced around, his steely confidence wavering for the first time. It must have been a coincidence, a glitch in the wiring or something. This was an old pub. He was sure that the electrics can't have been in the best of conditions. He decided to roll with it. His voice was now booming, a volatile combination of fear, uncertainty, and adrenaline. "The spirits are restless," he said, trying to maintain his composure. "They're reaching out to us." With trepidation he continued his chant, but now there was an edge to his voice, a tension that he'd never felt before. The chill in the air began to grow stronger, seeping into his bones. He began to shiver. Out of the corner of his eye he could see the group shifting uncomfortably, their earlier excitement fading into something else, something closer to fear. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The entire pub seemed to shudder, as if a great weight had settled over it. Mark swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Is this part of it?" the bearded man asked, his voice uncertain. Subconsciously they always knew that this was just a performance, but something was different. He could sense the worry and fear in his voice. Mark tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat like a vice. The temperature in the room continued to drop and a low hum began to fill the air. He could see a mist start to fall every time he breathed out. The hum was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in his skull. It was a deeply unpleasant sensation. For the first time in years, Mark felt genuine fear. His pulse had quickened and his breathing became more rapid. He tried his best to conceal the showman in him, battling against his primal instincts. He opened his eyes, looking around the pub. Most of the group were looking increasingly scared or worried. The slight murmur of conversation that had been accompanying his performance had now died down. The landlord, a burly man named Tom, frowned from behind the bar, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on, mate?" Tom called out, his voice cutting through the eerie hum. It seemed as though the spell was being broken, with the landlord's initial curiosity giving way to confusion. Mark didn't answer, though he couldn't. His heart was pounding in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He tried to stop the performance, to close any connections that he may have unwittingly opened, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if something was holding his tongue, forcing him to continue. The hum proceeded to grow even louder, more insistent, and the lights were now flickering constantly. The glasses on the tables began to rattle, the sound of clinking glass echoing through the pub. Mark's panic was clearly visible. Now, his face was as pale as a ghost and his hands were trembling. This isn't right," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the piercing hum. "What do you mean?" the bearded man asked with a tremble in his voice, his earlier bravado gone. "Isn't this part of the show?" Mark shook his head violently, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "No, I didn't. This isn't supposed to happen." The group stared at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. The hum had now reached a fever pitch, and with a loud pop the lights were extinguished, completely plunging the pub into darkness. A few people in the group screamed, their voices cutting through the sudden silence. Mark could feel the terror arising in the room, a tangible feeling that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, as if in slow motion, the glasses on the tables shattered into a million pieces, the sound of breaking glass filling the air as shards flew in every direction, glinting in the faint lights from the street lamps outside. The wine glasses hanging from the bar also proceeded to explode, causing the bar staff to duck for cover behind the bar. Mark flinched, raising his arms to shield himself, and clenched his eyes shut in reflex. He could hear the group around him crying out in fear, scrambling to get away from the vicinity, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The darkness proceeded to press in around him, thick and suffocating. He could feel a presence in the room with them. It felt vindictive and demonic. It was as if the air itself had turned against him, squeezing the life out of him with every labored breath. "Please," Mark gasped, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. Please stop." The spirit didn't listen. It had waited far too long for this, feeding off of years of his deception, growing stronger with every lie he told, and now it was free. Mark tried to cry out for help, but no sound came, his vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as his head throbbed with pain. He couldn't see them, but the group's screams had now transformed into oaked silence. They remained motionless now, almost scared to move in fear of what might happen next, and then the pain spread, the sharp stabbing unbearable. It was as though invisible hands were twisting his limbs, bending them in ways they were never meant to bend. He could feel his bones grinding against each other, his muscles tearing, but he couldn't move, couldn't scream. Blood began to seep from his nose, his eyes, his ears, dripping onto the table and the floor in thick dark droplets. The surrounding group watched in horror, their faces pale, but they didn't move. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. It had had to be part of the ACT, an elaborate but gruesome performance. They'd never seen anything like it. He must have been a very skilled performer indeed, but Mark knew better. He knew that this was no performance, this was real, and it was at the end. The unbearable pressure in his chest grew even stronger, and with a final agonizing twist something snapped deep inside of him, his body contorted one last time in a final violent spasm, and then everything went dark. He'd given his last and most powerful reading when the lights flickered back on. Mark was lying motionless on the table, surrounded by shards of glass. His limbs were twisted at natural angles, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, blood from around him staining the wooden floor and table. For a moment there was only silence. The entire pub was frozen in shock, and then, as if the audience erupted into applause, the sound was deafening, a roar of great approval that shook the walls. They cheered and clapped, their fear giving way to admiration for what they believed was the most convincing performance they'd ever seen. Many in the crowd were shaking their heads in disbelief, with smiles beginning to form on their faces. Mark Sutton, the accidental medium, lay dead in a pool of his own blood, his mouth gaping in a silent scream. The pub patrons, oblivious to the truth, raised the few remaining glasses in a toast, laughing and praising the spectacular show, but deep within the shadows something still lingered, something dark and hungry, feeding off of the fear and excitement of the crowd that had claimed its first victim. And it was only just beginning after a short while the laughter and applause gave way to silence yet again as the crowd started to understand the true extent of what had just taken place. They all started to notice that they too could still see their breath-forming clouds of mist in front of them as rain began to fall outside the dimly lit pub. Sharp screams started to fill the air, breaking the silence. The demonic entity had all the sustenance it could ever need, and in the end it would take them all. So guys, the video has ended now. If you like our stories and want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to Audible Odyssey channel and do all these things, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Enjoy horror and adventure stories like this. So just subscribe to Audible Odyssey. Bye bye.